All right, cool. Well, welcome to the webinar, Tableau Parameters, Everything You Should Know. I'm really grateful that a lot of you have taken some time out of this Friday morning to be able to be here and to go over a pretty fun and interesting and complex topic. And yeah, just really grateful to see a lot of names I recognize, a lot of former students. Really nice to meet you if we haven't crossed paths before. So yeah, we'll go ahead and we'll dive into this. So my name is Eric Parker. Like I said, I've met some of you before, and what I do for work a lot of times is I teach Tableau classes and I consult on projects. So I've been doing that for 6 years now. Work on some other platforms as well. And yeah, I think the inspiration for this webinar really came out of always having a lot of questions. About parameters, right? About how they work, what are some of the use cases, maybe even like what the definition is for parameters. And so just check my audio here to make sure. All right, looks like it's coming through. Okay, cool. So just thought we would take some time to look through that together. And just a few notes about this. There's a lot of content to get through, so it will be kind of fast paced. As I mentioned, there'll be a recording, so I'll make sure that I get that up in the next week, so you can come back to that. And feel free to shoot questions into the questions dialog throughout the webinar. However, I will probably be saving questions until the end, just because it will be easy for me to get sidetracked if not. And this workbook that I'm going to be showing you with all the examples, I will also publish that and link to that. So you can always download this and dig through it and reverse engineer things that you might want to as well. All right. So carrying on, let's just start by defining what parameters are. So I just Googled Tableau parameters definition and came across a whole bunch of different definitions because, well, there's a lot of ways you can use them. So parameters are global placeholder values that are designed to be able to let you create customization and interactivity in your Tableau visuals. Now, it's a really wide-ranging definition, and the reason for that is because there's a lot of different ways that you can use them, right? So I have listed 7 different examples down below, and time permitting, we'll actually look at all of those together. And then, yeah, if we have some extra time at the end, if you have specific questions or maybe even a specific way that you've been trying to use parameters, we could potentially take some time to look at that as well. Okay, so we'll kind of start with the more simple examples and then move our way into more complex. So one of the first examples I always like to look at with people is using parameters to be able to change the top number of values that you're looking at. So what I mean by that is right here, I've just got a Superstore worksheet showing the top 10 items by sales. And if I wanted to keep the top 10, there's a couple ways that I could do that. I could just manually select 10 bars and use Tableau's default filtering capability to keep only those. However, that's not going to be dynamic, right? If this data refreshes in a few months and there's a new top 10, it's still just going to keep these 10 items I selected. So what's a more dynamic way to keep your top 10 values would be to grab the dimensions on the worksheet. So in this case, product name. I'm going to drop a copy of that on filters. And I'm going to go to the top section and then hit this checkbox here, by field, top 10 by sum of sales. So I hit OK, and that's going to just keep those top 10 products, right? Now, the problem is with the way that we've set up this filter so far, our end user is not going to be able to change the top number of items they're looking at. So if I hit the drop down and say show filter, what happens is I get a text search. So I could look for a specific name of a product, but I can't change this from top 10 to top 15. Okay. So we'll go ahead and just remove that. So here's what I'll want to do instead. I'm going to hit the drop down on product name in the filters card, edit the filter, go to the top section, and instead of having it be a set number here, top 10, I'm going to change this drop down to allow me to create a parameter. So So like we talked about, parameters are just global workbook values. You get to make up what they possibly could be, and then your end user can make selections. So I'll call this top number of items to display. So because I generated it through this filter dialog, it already picked up it's going to be an integer. It defaulted to 10. This is probably what I'm most interested in right now is range of values. What do I want the number of possible items that my end user could select? What do I want those options to be? So let's say I want them to be able to see anywhere from the top 5 to the top 25 items. Okay. And then the step size, I will just leave it as 1. That means that it's going to be a slider that counts 5, 6, 7, 8 instead of 5, 10, 15, 20. So I'll hit OK. Notice instead of top 10, it says top by the parameter name. Hit OK again. My parameter shows up. So now, if I want to look at more than the top 10, it will change the top number of items that are being displayed. And something that I do very often when creating parameters is reference them in the title of the worksheet. So instead of saying what 10 items bring in the most revenue, I'm going to back out that static 10. I'm going to hit the insert dropdown to insert my parameter. Now, the cool thing about that is now as I change the parameter, it's actually going to change the title to reflect how many items you're displaying. Okay, so that's example number 1. Kind of, again, working a little basic, so we'll kind of continue to go into more complex types of options. The next example we're going to look at is how to switch a value in a calculation. So I'm just going to give you a second here to digest this chart that I've made. I've got a dual axis chart that's showing us 2 things. The first is how much we are selling in California. That's the green line. And then the blue line is what % of total sales are happening in California. So in Q1 2016, we sold $10,000 in California, which happened to make up 13% of all sales. Well, let's say that I want my end user to be able to change what state that is selected, right? So what about Washington? What about New York? What about Florida, right? So the way that all this is set up right now is I just have a couple of calculations where I hard-coded California into them. So for % of total sales, I said, give me all the sales if the state equals California, and then divide that by all sales, right? So here's what I'm going to do to make those calculations dynamic. I'm going to go to my state field in my data pane. I'm going to hit the drop down next to this field. And then I'm just going to say create parameter. Okay. Now, the cool thing about just creating a parameter directly from a dimension like that is that it will auto load that parameter with all the values from within that dimension. So I select this and then check it out. It just filled out the list for me, which of course is way nicer than trying to type out every one of the 50 states. Let's call this state for analysis. I don't think I really need to do anything here. I will just show you one thing that we're going to talk about more later, which is this little section over here, when workbook opens. This is new to Tableau version 2020.1. For those that are interested to learn more about dynamic parameters, we'll be talking about those toward the end of the webinar, and that's what this section is about. So right now, it's just a fixed list of the states that I just pulled, but I could use this bullet point here to make it dynamic so that if we had new states, like maybe we're now selling in Puerto Rico, that would automatically get added when the data updates rather than me having to come manually add that. All right, so I'll hit OK. And it did create a new parameter, right? You can see this listed down here under the parameter section of the data pane, state for analysis. It didn't automatically show up. So what I will need to do in this case is hit the drop down next to the parameter and say, show parameter control. Okay. At this point, the parameter has not been hooked up to anything, right? It's a list of roughly 50 possible values, but it doesn't do anything. It's just, I've just got a list and I'm just flipping through possible states. So what I need to do is I need to go back to those calculations that are referencing California. Edit this first one, it's the % of total sales, and I'm going to make this thing totally dynamic. So instead of California % of total sales, it'll be state % of total sales. instead of referencing California here, I'm going to reference the parameter instead. Okay. So you can leave the parameter just like that. Notice parameters are purple. When they're in a calculation, they're valid. You don't want to put that in quotes because Tableau will just read that as literal text. This is how it can read that dynamic text value. Okay. So that one's updated. Now I need to update the other calculation as well. It says California sales. Swap this out. All right. And this should be dynamic now. So as I pick different states, take Massachusetts, for instance, it's going to give me a different view. I pick Washington, it's going to give me a different view. And once again, this is kind of a crazy looking chart now, but once again, I'm going to go to the title and make sure that I don't have static text where it could be dynamic. So once again, I'm going to insert my parameter. Okay, so got through our first couple examples, changing the top number of items displayed, actually allowing a value to be all the transactions there. Yep, there you go. All right, so the third example that we'll look at is actually switching a field that's being referenced entirely. So this is an example I actually just pulled off my Tableau public. So what I'm going to do first is show you the finished version of this dashboard. Then we'll come back here and add the dynamic parameter into this. So this probably looks almost the exact same. In fact, you might not have even noticed that I just switched dashboards. But what this is just a high-level sales overview for a restaurant chain, so they could look at different locations of theirs and be able to see how much do we sell in food, how much trend, and then in the bottom, there's a tree map that's showing the top 10 items. And right now, that's showing the top 10 items by quantity, but I've rigged this up so it's dynamic. So if somebody was to want to say, see the top 10 items by sales, they could switch this drop down and see that instead. Or profit, see that. Okay, so coming back to the workbook we're working in, right now this tree map is not dynamic. It's just a top 10 by sales. So I'm going to show you what this item filter looks like. Okay, top 10 by total sales. So here's what I'm going to do to be able to create those different options. Let's say I'll just keep it simple and just do sales and profit for now. I'm going to hit the drop down next to dimensions, create a parameter. I'll call this display top 10 items by. And for data type, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just go with string. I want text options. And I'm just going to create a list of possible values. And again, we're keeping it simple. So we'll say sales and profit are our two options. So I'll hit OK. Get my new parameter down here. The drop down next to it, say show parameter control. Okay. And then once again, we haven't rigged it up anywhere. So as of right now, it doesn't really do anything. Okay. So what I want to do next is I want to create a calculated field that when the parameter is switched, it will output different measures. So I'll hit the drop down next to dimensions again, this time to create a calculated field. Just give it a generic name like measure. I'm going to use a case statement, which is a conditional statement similar to if-then statements if you ever use those. So I'll say in the case of parameter, when sales, then total sales. When profit, then total theoretical profit. So this is now a dynamic calculation. Depending on what's selected in the dropdown, you'll be able to have the visual update. So I'm going to hit OK. And there's a few places that we will want to reference this now. So I'm going to go ahead anywhere that I have total sales right now, like it's on size for the tree map, it's on label, and it's going to be in the filter dropdown as well. I want to put measure there instead. This here. This here. Go ahead and edit the filter. Change it from top 10 by total sales, top 10 by measure. Okay. Probably going to do a little number formatting here so that it has a dollar sign in front of it. Okay. And so the big thing that's actually making this dynamic is the fact that in this filter, I just changed this to be top 10 by this measure. So now, if I change this to be profit in the dropdown, it's going to give me my top 10 by profit instead of those top 10 by sales. Now, there's probably going to be a lot of overlap with those, so I don't think it changes a ton. But you can see the sizes are changing a little bit, and there might be some that become part of the top 10 that weren't. Like mushroom soup is much more profitable than it, like relative to paella or something. I don't know. I guess mushrooms are cheap. Not really the point of this webinar. Maybe we'll do a restaurant analysis webinar some other time. So there you go. We've got dynamic worksheet here, and of course, you could incorporate that into the dashboard as well. All right. So in a similar way that you could use what we just talked about is allowing people to use a dropdown to do dynamic sorting of something like a bar chart. So for instance, in this case, let's see, right now I've got a bar that's just showing me sales by state. So if I dropped profit on color here, you can see that, yeah, okay, usually when you have more sales, you have more profit, but that's not always the case, right? So if you look at Texas, for instance, Texas had a lot of sales at 170,000, but was pretty low from a profitability standpoint. So if I want to sort on profit right now, none of the default sort options, whether in the toolbar or on the axis, are going to let me sort by profit. So if you've learned how to do this before, what you might have been taught is, oh, okay, well, you can go to the state field on rows. Notice it has the little sort icon next to it. I can hit this drop down. I'm going to select sort. And then I'm just going to change up the dialog. So instead of being descending by sales, it's going to be descending by profit. All right. So notice now, instead of going high to low, it's going dark blue to dark orange. So that's awesome, right? It's sorted by profit now. But here's the issue. If anybody ever cleared that sort, meaning that they selected the sort icon here or on the toolbar or something, there's no way to get back to that sort by profit unless you just hit the back arrow a bunch of times to get back to that, which is not that ideal. So what I will do sometimes is give my end user different sorting options. So I'm going to create a parameter, and I'll call this sort states by. And we'll just do something very similar to what we just did in that last example. So I'll give them three options: sales, profit, and number of records, or let's call it number of transactions. Okay, I need to show my parameter control. And then here's the trick I'll use for this. I'm going to create a new calculated field. I'll call this our sort/rank field. And then once again, I'll use that case statement. So I'll say, in the case of this parameter, when it says sales, gotta make sure you get the spelling just right, capitalization, everything matters. Sum of sales, profit, then sum of profit. When it's gonna be the real test of my typing ability here. Number of transactions, then sum of number of records. And then what I'm going to do with this thing is I'm going to put the rank function around it. So it's going to rank them all, 1 through 50. And depending on what's selected in the dropdown, it's going to recalculate that rank. So I'm going to hit OK. And what I'm going to do with this sort rank field is I'm going to put it on rows, which is at first is going to look, well, here, let me explain this actually first. What I want to do is I want to put it as another column that's going to be hidden before the state field so that it lists it out 1 through 50. And then it will essentially force it to rank in that order, 1, 2, 3, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that sort rank field. First, it's going to give me a weird scatter plot because this is a continuous field, right? So this is telling us like California is 1 on that axis and however much in sales. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the drop down next to this field, and I'm going to switch it from being continuous to discrete. So here's the very simple way of thinking about continuous and discrete. Continuous creates axes, whereas discrete fields like state creates labels. So I'll switch this to discrete, and I'm actually going to put the rank field before the state field. And then here's why. So check this out. When I change this from sales to profit, notice it made a new 1 through 50. When I change this to number of transactions, it's actually reordering the bars for me. Okay. So your end user doesn't need to see those numbers. That's really just a trick we're using. So we can hit the drop down on this and deselect show header. So it's not showing, do some formatting to get rid of those lines. And now I think your end user actually can't screw up the sort. It's not even giving them the option. So their only option for sorting is now through this drop down, but that's a great way to control that environment for them. Cool. Okay. This next example, I'm feeling like in the interest of time, we won't get to talk about it in its full detail, but I did a blog post on it recently. So I'll make sure that in the follow-up content I put together, there's a link to how this works. What we were going to do if we had time was talk about how do you create dynamic labels. So for instance, this is a chart showing each of the 366 days of the year, including leap day, and how popular they are for birthdays. So for instance, if I want to see what are the top 10 most common birthdays in the US, I can highlight just those. Or if I want to see, well, what are just the bottom 10, like the least common birthdays, I can do that. So like I said, I will just provide you a link to a blog post that talks about how to do this. And it utilizes very similar things to what we just did, having a rank, only showing those that meet a certain criteria. But in the interest of getting to our last couple topics, this one will be a casualty of the clock. So more on that, and if there's people that want to stay late and look at that and have questions on that, we can. So that's everything I want to talk about from the standpoint of just regular parameters, like kind of the classic way that they are used. And now the last couple advanced topics that we'll take a look at will be, first of all, dynamic parameters. And well, actually there's kind of two different ways of saying this: parameter actions and then dynamic parameters. So let me show you an example of why you might want parameter actions. What I pulled up right here is just a portion of Tableau's website that's showing off actually something called set actions, but we're going to do something very similar. So typically the way Tableau works is when you do a drill down, like if I drill down from category to subcategory, use the hierarchy feature, it will drill down to all of the subcategories at once. Now, from a visual standpoint, that might not be ideal because you might only want to look at, a few subcategories at a time. So set actions, and in this case, what we're going to look at, parameter actions, are one way of being able to make it so you can drill down on just the section that you care about. So going back to our workbook, so the old school way, like I was saying, is there's a hierarchy. So notice, where is it? Yeah, I've got this location hierarchy, so it drills down from state to city. So if I hit the plus button by the state header, it's going to drill down into every city in every state at once, right? Whereas maybe I just wanted to click on New York and just see New York cities. So here's what I will do for this. I'm going to create a parameter based on my state field. Actually, I'll just use the one I had earlier. I'll just make a new one. So I'll create a parameter. I'll just call this selected state. And for now, I just need to pick one. So let's just pick New York as what it's going to be by default. I'll hit OK. Now I'm going to create a calculation that will only show me the cities for whatever state is currently selected in the parameter. So I'm going to hit the drop down, calculate field. Let's call this cities. So I will say if state equals selected state, then city, else blank. Okay, so show me the cities for whatever state is selected, otherwise just return a blank. So I'm going to move city. Because New York is the selected value in the parameter right now, only that one is being drilled down on. So the reason that these are called parameter actions is instead of just having a drop down where my end user could select, which is fine. I mean, we could use that if that's how we want this to work. What we're going to do instead is set it up so when my end user clicks on the name of a state, then it drills down on that state. So the way that you utilize that feature is I'm going to go to the worksheet dropdown on my toolbar, go to the actions selection. I'm going to add an action. This will be a change parameter action. And I'll just call this selected state action. So how I want this to work is when I select something within this worksheet parameter action asymmetric drill down. Well, first of all, what is that parameter going to be? It's going to be that one I just created, selected state. And then which field is it going to be driven off of? It will be driven off of the state field. Okay. And I don't think I need an aggregation. I guess we'll find out. So I'll hit OK and hit OK again. And if I did that right, always a big if. Now, as I select different states, it will just drill down on whatever state is being selected and not drill down on the others. So yeah, that is one way that you can use a parameter action. And I know we're kind of coming up on the half hour here, so I'm going to do one more example. For those that maybe got in a few minutes late, we are recording this. So if you do need to drop off, that's totally okay, because I'll have a recording up in the next week that you should be able to access and be able to see all of this again or see anything that you might have missed here at the very end. So our last example for now would be utilizing dynamic parameters. So I alluded to these earlier. Dynamic parameters allow the parameter to automatically update based on your data updating, so that you don't have to like manually add new values, for instance. So I've got these just like simple dashboard where I'm showing what was sales for the last 14 days, what was profit for the last 14 days, and then what was that trend line. So going into this, first of all, I set this up a little bit differently than you might be used to. A lot of times what people will do for showing something like the last 14 days is they'll use a relative date filter, meaning they'll put a date field on filters, pick relative date, and say, just give me my last 14 days. I did this a little bit differently, and I think you'll see why by the time that I'm done showing you how this all works. So what I did is I created a calculation that figures out what the latest date is in my data set. I'll provide a link that talks more about this, but what I did is I asked for the maximum order date, and then I wrapped it in these curly braces. So what those curly braces do is those are a level of detail expression that find the largest value in the entire data set. Okay? So just to show you what this is right now with the new worksheet, I put latest date out here. That's for month, day, year. I'm going to see it's December 30th, 2018. Okay, so then what I did is I created a calculation that would only grab the last 14 days based on that latest date field. Okay, so let's say that I want my end user to be able to pick what the latest date is in the data set. So instead of just being like a static calculation like what I just did, it's actually a drop down they can select from. So instead of seeing the last 14 days based on December 30th, maybe they want to go back to November 30th, for instance. Okay. So I'm going to go to my date field, hit the drop down, and create a parameter. Okay. I'll call this my reference date, and maybe I'll put in quotes today, so my end user understands what I mean by this. And then a couple things about this. So to make this dynamic so that this range of possible dates updates, instead of having a fixed range, which just picks exactly what the range of dates is now, 1/1/15 through 12/30/18, I'm going to change this so that when the workbook opens, it will automatically pull the range of dates for my order date field. Okay. And then the other thing is, what do I want that drop down to be by default? Do I just want it to always be 12/30/18, even if the data has updated to include more recent dates? Probably not. So what I'm going to do is when it says value when workbook opens, I'm going to change that to that calculation that I made latest. Right now, that's 12/30/18, but what I'm going to do is refresh this with a new data source so that it becomes, like 12/31 or 12/30/19. Okay. So let me go ahead and show my parameter control here. Let me go ahead and edit my last 14 days calculation. So instead of being based on that latest date field, it's based on my parameter. Okay. So nothing should have changed right off the bat, but we'll test this to make sure that it is actually changing. So if I pick like 11/30/18, okay, cool. It's showing us different values than it did before. So now here's the trick to this. I'm going to update this data source to a more recent version of Superstore. Here's track it down. And this data set should run through the end of 2019 if I grab the right one. Give this just a moment to load and do its thing. And let's see. Yeah, so there you go. You can see some values now coming through for 2019. Now, notice that parameter didn't update yet. It still says 12/30/18. But what we selected is that when the workbook is opened again, that's when that range of values would change. So watch this. I'm going to save and close our workbook. Finish doing its thing and saving. All right, cool. So there it is. Just saved. Got the right one there. Open that up. Yeah, I think that's still the old one. Well, there we go. So we'll wait on it while it does its thing. My big ta-da moment got delayed by a few extra seconds. But what you should see is that parameter, once it loads, the parameter in the top right corner will say 12/30/2019 instead of 12/30/2018 because the data has updated. And so this is how you would update it in a workbook that's on your computer. But if it's a workbook that's on Tableau server, it will just automatically update every time that somebody accesses it, right? That's considered opening a workbook, like, oh, I click and it loads the page and it will pull in the latest data. So if you have a live or a refresh connection on Tableau server, this will actually be a more seamless process than it was just here in Tableau desktop. All right. So yeah, that's just one example of dynamic parameters. Just thought I would show that so that you have a little bit of a feel for how that works. So thank you for staying a little bit over. I packed a lot of content into this, knowing that we might not be able to get to all of it, but I figured it's always better to have more examples than fewer. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stick around for a few minutes to answer some questions, and then I'll talk about like how to get access to this content and what all of that might look like. Okay. So I did have a few questions that were coming in just throughout, and like I said, I was just going to address them at the end. So I'll do the best I can to do that right now. Feel free to type your questions in, and then I'll try and get to as many as I can. So just as a reminder, you'll have access to the recording. You'll have access to this workbook I built. I'll link to a couple blog posts that talk about these topics. So these are things that you can come back and revisit, just especially because I know we went through that pretty fast. And then I had different kinds of questions around customizations. So Like if you had a date range, could you look at just the top products within date, like a specific date range that you care about rather than, the entire data set? Yes, that you would just need to do a bit of custom calculations for that, but no reason that wouldn't work. Another question was if you could drill down on multiple dimensions. I'm guessing that had to do with the parameter action. And yes, no reason you couldn't set up back-to-back parameter actions or set actions for that matter. So you can actually go multiple layers deep if you want to with that. Yeah. Cool. Let's see, a couple other questions here. When switching a field, can you change the formatting according to the measure that's selected? So like in that restaurant example I gave you, where it's right here. So some of the examples were like profit is a currency, but then other times I use something like quantity, which is just a pure number, right? So I actually used a little bit of an extra trick to make this work. I had a second calculation that was either showing a dollar sign or not, based on what was selected in the parameter. So that's kind of a little bit of like I'm going to call it a cheap way of being able to change the formatting. This gets a little bit trickier once you incorporate something like percentages, because percentages are usually communicated as decimals and may have several decimal places. In that case, there are tricks you can use. You can multiply by 100 and add a percentage sign at the end, things like that. So you could go down that route, or sometimes what people will do is they'll use that trick where they actually switch out a worksheet entirely using a parameter. So that's something we didn't have a chance to look at today, but yeah, you can use a parameter dropdown to actually switch which worksheet is displaying in the dashboard. And I'll just make a note to myself to make sure I include that as part of the follow-up as well for those that might want to see more about that. All right, I'll just do a few more questions here, and then any others we can kind of just do as like email back and forth. So is there a way to have a parameter action as a legend? I'm not sure. In my mind, I'm thinking about like a color legend when I hear that. And I would say not exactly, but what you can do is you can just create like a placeholder worksheet that has, let's say like your 4 different options from your parameter action. You could just create a worksheet that has those options and then just like float it in the corner of your dashboard. So that's sometimes what I will do is just do a little extra customization to get that to work. Okay, another question. If you have a date range with a parameter, could you have it show a calendar instead of like just a drop down of dates like what I showed? Yeah, I think you can actually, and that actually might be simpler than I'm even thinking. So this is just a big old range of values. But if I hit this drop down, oh, it does just say compact list. I have definitely seen parameters used as, or have calendar drop downs instead before. Maybe I will save that for another time looking into that, but I have definitely seen that done. So I know there is a way to be able to do that. Yeah. Cool. Getting a couple repeat questions. So those probably just things I hadn't answered by the time I got rid of them. Let's see if there's anything else new. Okay, cool. I think that hopefully I covered a lot of the questions. If I missed anything, which is totally possible because there was a lot of text there, just let me know. And that actually kind of leads us to kind of our great like closing and like what now. So if you're watching the recording, or even if you're here and you're just like, wow, that was a really powered up 30 or 40 minutes. I need time to digest this and think about it and maybe send questions later. You can just send them to me via email. So my email address listed here on the screen is eric.parker@onenumber.biz. If I answered your question, but I answered it wrongly or didn't understand your question, that's also great to be able to reiterate it there. And I'm happy to look at it in more detail. And then just for like what you can do to actually, I don't know, start learning this and really solidifying the concepts for yourself, practice, pick 1 or 2 of the things we looked at today or something you think is possible based on what we looked at today. And yeah, make it for yourself. I'll be sending out a link to the recording of this and some blog posts that are relevant based on this. So I would say definitely follow along there because parameters are one of the recurring topics that we seem to keep going back to. And then, yeah, feel free to reach out with questions or if you need anything in general from me. Like I said, I do training and I do consulting, and that's how I know a lot of you. So you're welcome to reach out to me with those kinds of inquiries as well. So thanks for being here. Yeah, thanks for spending a good part of your Friday morning with us. We really appreciate it. And yeah, have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. And I'll look forward to being in touch with you soon.